In the heart of Central Asia, where amber dust of ancient caravan routes still whispers secrets to the desert wind, lies a story that changed the world forever. Between towering peaks and endless steppes, where nomad horsemen thundered across horizons, a people emerged whose very name would become synonymous with commerce itself. They were the bridge between empires, weavers of the first global economy, masters of languages who could negotiate in Chinese courts at dawn and Persian palaces by dusk. For over a millennium, their caravans carried more than silk and silver across impossible distances. They transported ideas, religions, and technologies that reshaped civilizations from Rome to Beijing. In bustling bazaars of Samarkand and wine shops of Chang'an, they built networks of trust spanning continents, creating wealth that humbled emperors and influence that toppled dynasties. This is the chronicle of the Sogdian traders, merchant princes who ruled the Silk Road through patient cultivation of trust. Between the fierce winds that scour the steppes and the burning sands that stretch toward India's distant peaks, a green corridor cuts through Central Asia, like a blade of emerald set in bronze. Here, where the Zarafshan River flows through valleys blessed by mountain snows, where ancient waters carve channels deep enough to nourish civilizations, the seeds of empire take root in soil that will feed the dreams of merchants and kings for 1,000 years. This blessed realm knows abundance where desert peoples know only thirst. Springs that bubble from rocky heights carry life through underground channels that human hands will shape into networks more complex than any spider's web. Orchards heavy with fruit spread across terraces carved from cliffsides, while fields of grain stretch golden under skies that promise rain when the seasons turn. Here grows teff and barley. Here graze cattle whose milk feeds children destined to walk roads their ancestors cannot imagine. Stone lies ready beneath the earth, waiting for builders who understand that monuments speak longer than voices, that carved blocks argue more persuasively than bronze-tipped spears. Copper veins run through hills where future smiths will learn to forge tools that cut deeper than any enemy blade. Silver gleams in streambeds where patient hands will sift treasure from common gravel. Iron sleeps in mountainsides, dreaming of weapons that will make their wielders masters of a world larger than any chieftain dares envision. From these favored highlands, paths wind downward through passes where eagles nest and wolves hunt, threading between thorn forests and ancient trees, until they reach shores where waters burn like molten copper under Central Asian suns. Harbors that shelter fishing boats will someday welcome vessels bearing treasures from lands beyond the horizon's edge. Salt crystallizes in depressions where workers will labor under merciless heat to cut blocks whiter than snow, more precious than silver to peoples who live far from any sea. Geography writes the first chapter of destiny in valleys positioned like a bridge between empires yet unborn. Westward lie the grasslands where horsemen thunder across steppes that stretch beyond sight, their herds moving like clouds across green seas. Eastward rise peaks that guard the approaches to lands where silk grows on trees, and emperors rule from palaces built of yellow jade. Northward spread forests where fur-bearing creatures provide wealth to hunters bold enough to face winter's killing cold. Southward stretch deserts where caravans will someday wind between oases, following stars that guide them toward markets glittering with Indian jewels. Into this fertile crossroads come peoples whose bloodlines carry the accumulated wisdom of migrations that began when the world was young. Their ancestors rode with tribal confederations that swept across Eurasia like tsunamis of horsehair and iron, leaving behind scattered settlements wherever favorable ground invited permanent habitation. These are the children of wanderers who chose to plant roots, nomads who traded infinite horizons for the promise of harvests that would feed their grandchildren's children. Recent discoveries in burial grounds near Guyuan reveal the mixed heritage that flows in their veins like converging rivers. Bones tell stories written in calcium and marrow, speaking of ancestry that stretches back to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, that mysterious civilization that flourished between the great rivers when Egypt's pyramids were already ancient. Blood carries genetic memory of peoples who built cities in the desert and carved irrigation channels that turned wasteland into gardens of plenty. Cultural synthesis that would define their character for millennia begins in these early settlements, scattered along river valleys like pearls on a string. Villages that start as seasonal camps grow into permanent communities, as farmers discover which crops thrive in highland soil, and shepherds learn which grasses best nourish their flocks. Hunters who once followed game across endless steppes become craftsmen who shape clay and work metal, their wandering spirits channeled into arts that create beauty from common earth. Sacred fires that burn in their earliest temples carry flames brought from distant shrines, tended by priests who remember prayers in languages older than memory. These holy flames will never die, passed from generation to generation, like living heirlooms that connect present devotions to ancient covenants. Around these fires gather worshippers who see divinity in light that conquers darkness, who understand that truth shines brighter than any earthly treasure. Zoroaster's teachings reach these valleys, carried by merchants and missionaries who travel paths blazed by commerce and conquest. Sacred texts that speak of eternal struggle between light and darkness find eager audiences among peoples whose lives depend on seasonal cycles that bring either abundance or famine. Divine commandments that emphasize truth over falsehood, creation over destruction, provide moral frameworks that will guide their descendants through trials that test the strongest souls. Building techniques that create structures worthy of permanence develop as communities accumulate the wealth and stability needed for ambitious projects. Massive limestone blocks, each weighing more than 20 strong men, can rise into sanctuaries that will stand when empires crumble and dynasties fade into legend. Master builders who understand principles of leverage and proportion create monuments that speak of engineering knowledge sophisticated enough to rival anything accomplished in Babylon or Persepolis. At Yeha, where morning sunlight first touches peaks that scrape the belly of heaven, a temple rises that will inspire awe in visitors who come from realms that measure greatness in conquered territories and accumulated gold. No mortar binds these perfectly fitted stones, yet they hold together with strength that will endure earthquakes and withstand the erosion of centuries. Each block bears tool marks that reveal craftsmanship approaching artistic perfection, evidence of builders who understood that their work would serve as signature written in stone. Sacred attendants who serve in elevated shrines speak words borrowed from across narrow seas, where kingdoms flourish in incense groves that bleed precious resins. Ships carry more than mere goods between these shores. They bear the building blocks of civilization itself, the scripts and ceremonies that transform collections of mud huts into societies worthy of remembrance. Angular letters that will evolve into Ge'ez script take shape on clay tablets in these early centuries, each character carved with precision that reflects scribes' understanding of written words' power. Influence flows both ways, across waters that separate continents like a river separates fields. While foreign traders bring architectural knowledge and written language to highland settlements, local dealers carry treasures that reshape distant realms' understanding of wealth. Precious metal dust sifted from mountain streams purchases respect from kingdoms that measure worth in military might. Ivory carved from elephants that once thundered through forests, now vanished commands. Prices that humble foreign courts. Exotic woods whose fragrance intoxicates buyers, willing to pay any price for beauty that cannot be found elsewhere. Deep in rocky defiles where streams carve channels through living stone, smiths master arts that transform common ore into tools and weapons capable of reshaping the world. Smelting secrets, guarded by clans who pass knowledge from father to son like sacred flames, give these peoples advantages their enemies cannot match. Metal-tipped spears pierce bronze shields like fire through wax, while forged blades cut through copper swords with edges that hold their sharpness through countless battles. Hammer blows that ring against anvils, echo through valleys where deer leap and eagles hunt, creating music that announces the birth of technologies destined to forge empires. Workers who understand heat and timing, who know which ores yield the finest metal and which combinations create alloys stronger than their components, develop skills that will equip armies capable of conquering distant lands. Bronze and iron shaped by these craftsmen will arm warriors whose descendants rule territories spanning from desert shores to mountain peaks. Agricultural miracles transform steep hillsides into stepped gardens that climb toward clouds like stairs built for giants. Terraced fields carved from living rock and filled with soil carried in baskets from distant valleys demonstrate engineering principles that would impress builders of Babylon's hanging gardens. Mathematical precision guides water through channels cut with accuracy that ensures every planted seed receives its share of precious rainfall. Farmers who create these elevated gardens understand drainage and irrigation with knowledge that rivals the wisdom of engineers who served pharaohs and kings. Their children run through settlements where clean air burns in their lungs, where muscles develop under constant challenge of climbing toward the sky. Warriors trained on these heights move like mountain cats when they descend to fight in lowlands, their endurance forged by altitude that leaves foreign enemies gasping for breath they cannot catch. Commercial paths begin as footpaths worn smooth by generations of travelers carrying goods between communities that specialize in different forms of wealth. Salt, white as fresh snow, and precious as jewels to peoples who live far from any sea, travels from desert depressions where it crystallizes under merciless suns. Workers who cut these mineral treasures from earth baked harder than pottery labor under conditions that would kill weaker breeds, their skin burned dark as copper, their eyes narrowed against glare that could blind the unwary. Ivory flows down these same paths, torn from elephants whose tusks grew through decades of patient feeding in forests, where acacia trees spread canopies wider than temples. Hunters who bring down these giants possess courage that borders on madness, facing beasts that can crush a man with one careless step. Their spears must find the exact spot behind the great ear where death waits, or they themselves become offerings to gods who demand blood for blood. Precious metal dust winnowed from streams with patience that spans. Lifetimes fills leather pouches that travel under armed guard, through passes where bandits wait like vultures for unwary prey. Prospectors who wash this treasure from gravels understand currents and deposits as intimately as lovers know each other's bodies, reading landscape like sacred scrolls that reveal where peak's blood flows richest. Frankincense and myrrh, tears of trees that grow only in the most favored valleys, command prices that make kings weep with envy. These sacred resins burn on altars from Egyptian temples to Roman household shrines, their smoke carrying prayers toward heaven with perfume that gods themselves find sweet. Collectors who gather these precious drops must know the exact moment when wounded bark yields its treasure, must understand subtle differences between varieties that separate fortune from poverty. Chiefs who control strategic valleys begin to understand that prosperity requires protection, as surely as crops require water. Caravans that bring wealth to markets also attract raiders from surrounding territories, desperate men who prefer stealing to honest exchange, warriors who serve ambitious lords whose domains cannot satisfy their appetites. Defense becomes as crucial as production, military organization as important as agricultural innovation. Early alliances form between rulers, like streams joining to create rivers capable of carrying larger burdens. A chief who controls salt-producing regions joins forces with another who commands grain-rich highlands, together fielding armies large enough to protect their combined territories and punish raiders who threaten paths that feed their prosperity. These confederations plant seeds of imperial thinking, understanding that unity brings strength beyond the sum of individual parts. Religious practices evolve alongside political structures, like vines growing on the same tree, each strengthening the other until separation becomes impossible. Gods who watch over these peoples demand more than simple offerings. They require elaborate ceremonies that only prosperous communities can afford. Sacred attendants who serve these deities must be fed and housed. Temples must be built and maintained. Festivals must be celebrated with splendor that demonstrates divine favor. Pilgrims make their way through mountain passes to reach sanctuaries that become centers of regional devotion. Their offerings of grain and livestock, precious metals and ivory, create treasuries that rival those of established kingdoms. Attendants who administer these riches develop systems of record-keeping and distribution that serve as models for later governmental bureaucracies, intertwining sacred and secular power until they become indistinguishable. Stone carvers working on temple walls develop artistic styles that influence sculptors for generations to come. Their chisels transform blank granite into scenes of religious ceremony, immortalizing rites that might otherwise vanish with those who perform them. These carved surfaces become libraries for those who cannot read written words, textbooks for those who learn history through images rather than scripts. Bronze workers who create temple furnishings master techniques that make their descendants famous throughout the ancient world. Incense burners, ceremonial vessels, ritual weapons. Each piece reflects metallurgical understanding that rivals the finest works of Syrian and Egyptian craftsmen. Copper and tin, required for these creations, arrive through networks that span continents, proof that these peoples participate in exchanges connecting the known world. Musicians who perform in sacred ceremonies develop styles that blend local traditions with melodies learned from foreign merchants. Drums carved from single tree trunks carry rhythms that make listeners' hearts beat in harmony with mountain pulse. Lyres strung with cattle gut sing songs that mix local legends with tales heard in distant markets, creating musical traditions that echo through generations as soundtracks for imperial celebrations yet to come. Marriage alliances between ruling families create kinship networks that span highlands like webs spun by giant spiders. A daughter from salt regions marries a son from precious metal streams, binding their peoples together with bonds stronger than military conquest. Children born of these unions inherit claims to territories scattered across peaks, their bloodlines creating maps that guide future expansion. Storytellers who perform at wedding feasts and funeral ceremonies memorize genealogies stretching back to first ancestors, epic poems celebrating heroes whose deeds grow larger than life with each retelling. These living libraries carry forward cultural DNA of peoples destined to rule from Red Sea shores to Nile tributaries, their voices preserving wisdom that written scrolls might lose to fire or flood. Languages begin merging and evolving as peoples interact with foreign dealers who bring goods and ideas from distant shores. Cushitic words combine with Semitic vocabulary, creating linguistic alloys stronger than their component parts. Scripts that will become sophisticated writing systems emerge from this cultural fusion, characters adapted from foreign models but shaped by local needs and genius. Young warriors trained in fighting techniques learn to adapt tactics developed for rocky terrain to battlefields found in different environments. Hit-and-run strategies that work against raiders must be modified for fighting disciplined formations on open ground. Weapons designed for mountain warfare require adjustment for desert combat, accumulating military knowledge that proves invaluable when descendants face legions of Rome and armies of Persia. Agricultural innovations spread between communities, like seeds carried by favorable winds to fertile ground. Techniques for terracing steep slopes appear in distant settlements within planting seasons of their development. Methods for preserving grain through harsh winters travel paths faster than merchants who carry other goods, creating accumulated wisdom that supports urban populations and professional armies. Craft specialization increases as communities grow prosperous enough to support artisans who work full-time at their trades. Potters develop styles that influence ceramic traditions for centuries, while weavers create textiles whose patterns encode cultural meanings that only initiates can read. Leatherworkers perfect techniques for preparing hides that equip armies and adorn palaces, each craft tradition becoming thread in cultural fabric that binds communities together. Proto-Aksumite elite, who will eventually unify scattered settlements, begin emerging from this matrix of commerce, religion, and warfare. These are chiefs who control the most profitable paths, sacred attendants who serve the most powerful gods, warriors who win the most decisive victories. Their authority derives not from ancient bloodlines, but from demonstrated competence, making them natural leaders for peoples who value achievement over ancestry. Female rulers appear among these emerging chiefs, their authority based on the same combination of prosperity, religious sanction, and military success that empowers their male counterparts. Queens who control key routes command respect from peoples who judge leaders by results rather than gender, their courts becoming famous for luxury and wisdom that attracts ambitious nobles from throughout the highlands. As the first century of the Common Era dawns, scattered realms possess technological knowledge, accumulated prosperity, cultural sophistication, and military capability needed to forge empire. Networks stretch across the known world. Religious institutions provide frameworks for governance. Agricultural surpluses support specialized populations, and military traditions ensure ability to defend what has been built. Transformation from chiefdoms to regional power awaits only the emergence of rulers with vision large enough to encompass possibilities that surround them. Those leaders stand ready in history's wings, their names still unknown, but their destiny written in carved sanctuaries, precious goods, and forged weapons that ancestors have prepared for them. On mountain winds drifts the perfume of frankincense and the ring of hammer on iron, the echo of empire rising from work of forgotten heroes whose greatest monument is the civilization they helped shape. Soon, very soon, the name that will echo from courts of Rome to palaces of Persia will emerge from these highland valleys as peoples take their place among the great powers of the ancient world. over plains swept by icy winds and whispers of distant snows. Riders charge toward distant horizons blurred by summer's glare. Dust rises in their wake like smoke from smoldering ruins, a sign of ambitions stretching beyond the edge of any known realm. Alexander's warriors, bronze flashing beneath relentless skies, descend from the Hindu Kush to confront destinies that will reshape history. Marakanda stands defiant on her hill, like a jewel set in a crown of thorns, her walls rising from earth that has drunk the blood of heroes and kings. Within those ramparts, Spitameni's marshals resistance that will cost the conqueror more than any victory is worth. This is no mere chieftain defending his cattle and grain stores. This is a general who understands that freedom dies hard in peoples born to wide skies and endless horizons. When bronze meets iron in battles that echo across valleys where eagles nest, the clash creates sparks that ignite changes no prophet could foresee. Macedonian phalanxes that conquered Persia and humbled Egypt find themselves facing enemies who fight like wolves, appearing from nowhere to strike and vanish before retaliation can follow. Guerrilla warfare that will become the signature of Highland resistance teaches lessons written in blood across rocky ground where conventional tactics prove useless. Yet conquest plants seeds that grow into hybrid vigor, stronger than either parent stock. Greek colonists who choose to remain after their armies withdraw discover that survival requires adaptation, marriage, and synthesis. Children born of unions between Hellenic soldiers and local women inherit the best of both worlds: Mediterranean sophistication wedded to Central Asian endurance, creating bloodlines that will produce merchant princes and warrior kings. Stone speaks multiple tongues in buildings that rise from this collision. Columned porticos that echo Athens and Alexandria stand alongside courtyards designed for peoples who understand that true wealth flows from hospitality offered to strangers bearing goods from distant lands. Gardens where Greek philosophers once walked become gathering places where Eastern wisdom meets Western logic in conversations that reshape both traditions. Networks that survived Alexander's passage like rivers flowing around boulders gradually reconnect and strengthen as political stability returns to territories that once trembled under marching feet. Caravans that waited in hidden valleys during the worst fighting emerged to find new opportunities created by connections between previously isolated regions. Roads built by military engineers to move armies become highways that carry silk from China and spices from India toward markets hungry for exotic luxuries. From the south, where Gandhara's Buddhist monasteries rise like lotus flowers from fertile ground, comes influence that will transform Highland society more profoundly than any military conquest. Merchants who carry more than mere goods in their saddlebags bring teachings that speak of liberation from suffering and paths that lead beyond the cycle of birth and death. Sacred texts that arrive with trading caravans bear wisdom accumulated through centuries of meditation and debate. Palm leaf pages carrying Sanskrit verses challenge Highland scholars to master languages that unlock treasures of knowledge. Buddhist sutras describing the middle way between extreme asceticism and self-indulgence find eager audiences among peoples whose lives depend on finding balance between opposing forces. Monasteries that rise in highland valleys become centers where Greek philosophy, Persian theology, and Indian spirituality merge into new forms of understanding. Scribes laboring in these early monasteries create traditions that will influence generations of scholars and poets. Their efforts to render Sanskrit concepts into local tongues, Greek philosophical terms into Highland dialects, create vocabularies rich enough to express the most sophisticated thoughts any human mind can conceive. Translation work that begins in candlelit chambers becomes the foundation for literature that will carry these people's voices across centuries. From the north, where nomadic confederations rule grasslands that stretch beyond any horizon, come influences that strengthen military traditions already renowned for their effectiveness. Horses bred for speed and endurance arrive in highland markets, their bloodlines carrying genetic heritage that will produce cavalry capable of outrunning any pursuit and outfighting any enemy. Riding techniques that enable warriors to shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, while galloping at full speed transform highland armies into forces that can project power across vast distances. Smiths who once struggled to create iron hard enough to hold an edge learned from northern masters to produce steel that cuts through bronze like a blade through silk. Armor that combines flexibility with protection enables warriors to move with deadly grace while turning aside enemy weapons that would otherwise prove fatal. Workshops that once echoed with the simple rhythm of hammer on anvil now ring with complex melodies as craftsmen forge alloys that surpass anything their ancestors imagined possible. Pottery that emerges from highland workshops demonstrates how artistic synthesis creates beauty, transcending ethnic boundaries. Vessels that combine Greek geometric patterns with local animal motifs prove both beautiful enough to grace royal tables and sturdy enough for daily use. Textiles that weave Hellenistic designs into highland patterns create fabrics commanding premium prices in markets from Rome to China, their beauty speaking tongues that transcend cultural limitations. Jewelers working in highland ateliers master techniques that rival anything produced in Alexandria or Antioch. Precious metals shaped into forms honoring both Greek aesthetic principles and local spiritual symbols create ornaments satisfying sophisticated tastes while maintaining authenticity. Gems arriving through expanding networks find settings that enhance their natural beauty while incorporating motifs speaking to highland souls. Practical wisdom, rather than abstract philosophy, drives the tolerance that becomes characteristic of highland society. Communities depending on trade with diverse partners cannot afford to alienate customers based on their spiritual beliefs. Shrines welcoming travelers, regardless of their gods, create neutral ground where business proceeds without friction, interfering with profitable exchanges. Festivals that evolve during this period blend elements from multiple traditions into celebrations, reinforcing social cohesion while accommodating diverse beliefs. Seasonal observances, honoring local deities, incorporate ceremonies borrowed from trading partners, creating hybrid rituals that strengthen relationships while maintaining spiritual authenticity. Music and dance accompanying these festivals develop styles, influencing artistic expression throughout the region. Palaces housing regional governors combine defensive necessity with residential comfort, their walls thick enough to withstand siege, while their gardens provide peaceful retreats from governmental responsibilities. Buildings that process the growing complexity of international commerce feature storage facilities, meeting halls, and record-keeping chambers, enabling efficient management of expanding bureaucracies. Streets laid out in geometric patterns facilitate movement of goods and people, while creating vistas that please the eye and lift the spirit. Market squares positioned at strategic intersections become gathering places where merchants from different societies meet to exchange not only goods, but ideas, techniques, and stories that enrich intellectual life. Water management that channels mountain runoff through carefully designed networks brings life to territories that once supported only sparse populations. Schools that emerge to serve expanding governmental needs train young people for careers requiring sophisticated skills. Students master reading and writing in multiple scripts while learning mathematics, geography, and diplomatic protocol. Apprenticeships that preserve technical knowledge while encouraging innovation ensure continuity, surviving individual careers and generational transitions. Courts that govern increasingly complex relationships draw upon multiple traditions while maintaining practical effectiveness. Judges who apply justice fairly regardless of litigants' backgrounds create confidence, encouraging long-term investment and partnership formation. Laws that protect honest dealers while punishing fraud establish reputations for reliability, attracting business from distant markets. Ambassadors representing Highland interests in foreign courts learn to navigate complex ceremonial requirements while advancing practical objectives. Treaties establishing boundaries, regulating trade, and providing mutual defense create stability, encouraging economic development and exchange. Protocols that emerge from these diplomatic contacts influence international relations throughout the region. Forces that evolve to meet changing strategic requirements combine traditional Highland advantages with innovations learned from contact with foreign armies. Infantry formations that maintain flexibility essential for mountain warfare adopt discipline and coordination techniques proving effective in lowland campaigns. Cavalry units exploiting superior horses and riding skills develop tactics, enabling rapid strikes against enemies lacking comparable mobility. Smiths working in workshops carved from living rock forge blades, whose edges hold their sharpness through countless battles. Armorers create protective gear that turns aside enemy weapons while allowing freedom of movement essential for Highland fighting techniques. Siege engineers design machines capable of reducing any fortress their enemies might construct. Merchants who understand that reputation spans generations cultivate honesty that becomes their greatest competitive advantage. Standards maintaining consistent weights and metal content establish trust, enabling commerce across boundaries. Banking arrangements providing credit and transfer services make long-distance trade practical for dealers lacking resources to fund entire expeditions from their own treasuries. Pack animals selected for endurance and reliability carry maximum loads while maintaining speed, necessary for profitable operations. Route planning that considers seasonal weather, water availability, and security threats creates schedules minimizing risks while maximizing opportunities for successful exchanges. Navigation techniques, utilizing knowledge accumulated through generations of travel experience, enable caravans to maintain course, even when familiar landmarks disappear behind sandstorms or mountain mists. Exchange that accompanies expansion creates intellectual ferment, producing innovations in multiple fields. Medical knowledge, combining Greek theoretical understanding with Indian practical experience and local herbal traditions, develops treatments proving more effective than any single tradition could provide. Agricultural techniques merging foreign crop varieties with local farming methods increase productivity while maintaining soil fertility. Scholars who study celestial movements learn to predict seasonal changes with accuracy, enabling better planning. Ceremonies that incorporate astronomical knowledge create connections between earthly activities and cosmic rhythms, reinforcing spiritual understanding. Alloys combining local copper with imported tin create bronze of exceptional quality, while steel production incorporating foreign knowledge creates metal superior to anything previously available. Silk arriving from China finds local weavers who blend it with domestic materials to create hybrid fabrics, combining exotic appeal with practical durability. Dyeing techniques utilizing imported colorants produce textiles whose beauty and color fastness make them sought-after exports. Grape cultivation that enables wine production creates new export opportunities, while providing social lubricants facilitating negotiations. Horses combining northern speed with highland endurance produce cavalry mounts superior to any enemy's animals. Cattle, providing both milk and meat, enable population growth while supporting leather industries serving both domestic and export markets. Breeding programs that incorporate foreign stock improve local herds while creating new categories of livestock for specific purposes. As the 2nd century approaches its conclusion, Highland society has transformed itself from isolated communities into sophisticated civilization capable of participating as equals in international affairs. Networks spanning continents, traditions synthesizing influences from multiple sources, capabilities commanding respect from potential enemies, and institutions maintaining order across diverse populations create foundations strong enough to support imperial ambitions. Structures that emerge during this period provide frameworks. Future rulers will expand into true dominion over vast territories. Systems managing complex relationships demonstrate capabilities that can be scaled up to govern provinces and conduct international relations. Traditions proving effective in regional conflicts possess potential for campaigns that will reshape the balance of power throughout Central Asia. Cohesion, developing through successful management of diversity, creates unity transcending ethnic and theological differences without erasing them entirely. Prosperity, resulting from participation in international commerce, provides resources, funding, ambitious projects, and sustaining professional armies. Sophistication, emerging from exposure to multiple traditions, creates leadership capable of envisioning and implementing policies, serving long-term strategic objectives. Seeds of future greatness lie ready to sprout when conditions prove favorable for their growth. Relationships currently serving regional markets possess potential for expansion into networks connecting the Mediterranean world with the Indian Ocean and beyond. Capabilities now providing security for highland territories could project power across vast distances when properly organized and equipped. Dawn approaches for peoples whose ancestors chose settlement over wandering, who built permanent homes in valleys blessed by mountain streams and highland breezes. What they have accomplished during centuries of patient development provides foundations for achievements that will astonish the world, for empire that will make their names echo in halls of Roman senators and Persian nobles, for dominion that will carry their influence to shores they have never seen, but will someday rule through the power of trade and accumulated wealth. Beyond the crumbling walls, where Kushan emperors once held court, where their golden coins still glitter in ruins that echo with vanished grandeur, a new age dawns across Central Asia, like sunlight breaking over mountain peaks. Imperial collapse that might have brought chaos instead clears ground for fresh growth, for ambitions that will prove larger than any single dynasty's dreams. From Samarkand's oasis gardens to Bukhara's bustling markets, from the salt mines of distant deserts to the jade routes that wind toward China's yellow gates, a people rises whose very name will become synonymous with commerce itself. In chambers where lamplight flickers against carved walls, where the scent of frankincense mingles with the rustle of precious silks, merchant princes gather to plan expeditions that will reshape the ancient world's understanding of distance and profit. These are no mere peddlers content to trade glass beads for grain in village squares. These are visionaries who see opportunity stretching like golden thread from the Mediterranean shores to the Pacific's edge, who understand that true wealth flows not from conquest, but from the patient cultivation of trust across cultural boundaries that divide humanity into suspicious tribes. Samarkand stands at the center of this revolution, like a spider in a web spun from silver and silk. Her markets, shaded by awnings that flutter in desert breezes, host exchanges that connect Rome's appetite for exotic luxuries with China's inexhaustible production of treasures no Western artisan can duplicate. Voices speaking a dozen languages create a symphony of negotiation, their words shaping contracts that will send caravans across deserts where lesser men would perish from thirst and exhaustion. Success demands more than superior products or favorable prices. Survival in the dangerous world of long-distance commerce requires reputation for honesty that spans generations, abilities that enable communication across cultural divides, and diplomatic finesse that maintains neutrality when empires clash around trading posts. These qualities, cultivated through centuries of patient development, become the distinctive advantages that establish dominion over the roads between worlds. Contracts that emerge from this period demonstrate legal thinking sophisticated enough to protect investors while encouraging enterprise. Partners who may never meet face to face create agreements that divide profits fairly across years of dangerous travel. When a merchant dies in distant lands, his share passes to children who inherit not merely wealth, but commercial relationships that outlast individual lives, building dynasties that accumulate wisdom through decades of successful operations. From necessity springs mastery of tongues that transforms these traders into living bridges between civilizations that might otherwise remain eternally isolated. A single merchant might conduct morning negotiations in Chinese ideographs, afternoon discussions in Aramaic script, and evening consultations in Greek letters. His abilities enabling not merely exchange of goods, but transmission of ideas, techniques, and artistic styles across distances that armies cannot traverse. Wisdom, rather than abstract philosophy, drives the tolerance that characterizes their society. Caravans that welcome Zoroastrian fire worshippers, Buddhist monks, Christian pilgrims, and pagan shamans create neutral ground where business proceeds without spiritual friction. When travelers of different faiths rest at the same oasis, when they share water from the same well and shelter beneath the same stars, commerce becomes the common language that enables cooperation despite theological disagreements. Silver that maintains consistent weight and purity across vast distances creates trust, enabling long-term contracts and deferred payments. Coins bearing images of dead emperors continue circulating long after the dynasties that minted them collapse into dust, their value resting not on political authority, but on the reputation of the merchants who accept and honor them. Such monetary systems provide continuity that survives the upheavals which destroy kingdoms. Into this prosperous world erupts catastrophe that will test every bond of trust and kinship these communities have built. From the northern steppes, where winter winds carry the scent of snow and horses, comes invasion that sweeps across Central Asia, like wildfire consuming dry grass. Hun confederations, whose military might toppled Chinese dynasties and terrorized Roman provinces, pour through mountain passes like tsunamis of horsehair and iron, their advance marked by smoke columns that rise from burning cities. In a watchtower west of Dunhuang, where Chinese garrisons maintain lonely vigil against raiders who emerge from trackless deserts, a postal bag waits for messengers who will never come. Within its leather confines lie documents that preserve voices from across the centuries, correspondence that captures human drama more vividly than any chronicle composed by court historians safe in distant palaces. These letters, intended for eyes that will never see them, become windows through which future generations glimpse the reality of commerce interrupted by warfare. Nanai Vandak dips his reed pen in ink, lamplight flickering across parchment as he chooses words carefully for partners who wait in Samarkand for news that may never reach them. His message begins with the courtesies that bind merchants across distance and danger, but quickly turns to reports that chill the blood. Honored partners, the situation here grows more desperate with each passing day. Luoyang burns, its palaces reduced to ash and rubble. The emperor has fled his capital like a common thief in the night, leaving his people to face consequences of his weakness. Business concerns mingle with personal fears as he records the fate of agents scattered across a collapsing realm. Armatsakh in Juquan remains safe for now, though how long security will last, none can say. Arsak in Guzang sends word that trade has ceased entirely. No caravans dare venture forth when roads run red with blood. It is 3 years since any messenger arrived from our homeland. 3 years since we learned whether our families still draw breath. Practical matters occupy his thoughts despite the chaos surrounding him. The silk shipment intended for Western markets lies in warehouses we dare not approach. The goods worthless if we cannot transport them safely. The precious metals we accumulated through careful trading now serve as bribes for guards whose loyalty shifts with each rumor of advancing armies. Personal anguish breaks through his reserve as he contemplates separation from everything that gives life meaning. My son, Taksich Vandak, grows to manhood without his father's guidance. Learning lessons I cannot teach from tutors I cannot pay. If these troubles continue, if the roads remain closed to honest commerce, I fear I shall never see him again, never witness his marriage or hold his children in my arms. Desperation drives him to make arrangements that reveal the depth of his despair. Should fate prevent my return to Samarkand, I entrust his welfare to your care. The sum of 800 silver pieces awaits investment in his name. Use it wisely to secure his future and find him a wife worthy of our family's honor. Let him know that his father died thinking of home, dreaming of valleys where peace reigns and merchants travel without fear. 3 years of silence from home weigh on his spirit, like stones crushing a man buried alive. Contact with family and partners that once flowed as regularly as seasonal rains has ceased entirely, leaving him isolated in a foreign land where familiar faces disappear daily and trusted allies become refugees, fleeing toward uncertain sanctuary. The networks that once carried information faster than imperial couriers now lie broken like bridges destroyed by flood. Meanwhile, in Dunhuang's dusty streets, where foreign merchants cluster in neighborhoods that echo with a dozen tongues, another tragedy unfolds with the slow inevitability of desert drought. Mune wraps her daughter closer against the wind that carries sand and despair in equal measure, her eyes scanning crowds for a husband who abandoned them 3 years ago with promises he never intended to keep. Her words, intended for the mother she may never see again, speak in voices that transcend cultural boundaries, to touch experiences of abandonment and survival known to women in every age. Honored mother, your daughter writes from exile that grows more bitter with each passing day. Nanaidat brought us to this foreign place with words sweet as honey, then vanished like morning mist when responsibilities became burdens he would not bear. Economic desperation drives her to choices no woman should face alone. Our clothing grows threadbare, our food supplies dwindle daily. The priest at the fire temple offers charity that keeps us from starvation, but such dependence wounds my pride deeper than any physical blow. How long can we survive on the kindness of strangers who have their own families to feed? Social isolation compounds material hardship as she discovers how precarious a woman's position becomes without male protection. Fan Shund who claims kinship through marriage, refuses to provide passage home. He speaks of expenses and difficulties, but I see calculation in his eyes. He hopes desperation will drive us to accept arrangements that serve his interests rather than our welfare. Differences that once seemed charming become barriers threatening survival when resources disappear and protection vanishes. The local customs that once amused us now confuse and frighten. Officials who might assist us speak tongues we barely understand, follow procedures that seem designed to discourage rather than help. Without Nanaidat to navigate these complications, we remain trapped like birds in cages whose keys lie beyond our reach. Maternal desperation drives her to contemplate options that violate everything she was taught about honor and family loyalty. Your granddaughter grows thinner each day, her laughter fading like flowers in drought. If no word comes from her father soon, if no relative agrees to escort us home, Fanshund threatens to sell us both into Chinese households where we would serve strangers who care nothing for our heritage or dignity. Hope battles against despair as she clings to possibilities that grow fainter with each day of silence. The priest speaks of caravans departing for Samarkand when spring arrives. Merchants who might accept passengers in exchange for services we could provide. Yet winter approaches, and survival until spring seems as distant as the mountains that separate us from home. Her final words carry rage that burns hotter than any fire temple flame, anger that transforms victim into accuser willing to speak truths that polite society prefers to ignore. If Nanaidat still lives, if these words somehow reach his ears, let him know that his wife and daughter remember his promises. Better to be the wife of a dog or pig than to be bound to a man who values profit above family, who abandons those who trusted him for the sake of ventures that will never bring the satisfaction that comes from love freely given and faithfully kept. Documents that preserve these voices remained sealed in their leather pouch, awaiting delivery that never came, carrying news that never reached its intended recipients. The postal system that once connected scattered communities across vast distances collapsed along with the imperial structure that maintained it, leaving families permanently separated by gaps that no amount of wealth could bridge. Though chaos shook the familiar rhythms of society and commerce, more lasting changes stirred below the noise. Practices developed over generations of successful trading proved resilient enough to survive temporary setbacks, while the synthesis that created these remarkable societies provided foundations for rebuilding when stability returned to regions that had known only warfare and uncertainty. In workshops where artisans shape metal and weave cloth, techniques borrowed from distant masters merge with traditions inherited from ancestors, creating products that satisfy diverse tastes while establishing artistic standards influencing craftsmen throughout the region. Textiles that combine methods from multiple sources achieve beauty transcending limitations while maintaining value that ensures preservation. Metalwork that incorporates foreign designs with local preferences produces objects coveted from Constantinople to Beijing. Schools established in the growing cities train young people for careers, requiring sophisticated skills and understanding. Students master not merely reading and writing in multiple scripts, but geography, mathematics, and the diplomatic protocols necessary for success in international commerce. Apprentices learn not only their crafts, but the subtleties of cross-cultural communication that transform potential conflicts into profitable partnerships. Courts that apply justice fairly regardless of litigants' origins establish reputations for reliability that attract business from distant markets. Judges who understand both local customs and foreign expectations create legal frameworks that protect honest dealers while punishing fraud, maintaining standards that preserve the trust essential for operations spanning continents. Such institutions survive political upheavals that destroy empires. Centers that grow around major trading hubs reflect planning principles serving both practical and aesthetic purposes. Market areas accommodate merchants from different societies while maintaining efficient traffic flow, creating spaces where business proceeds smoothly, despite obstacles of language and custom. Residential districts provide appropriate housing for diverse populations, while fostering harmony that demonstrates governmental wisdom transcending mere administrative competence. Forces that protect expanding interests demonstrate strategic thinking, balancing defensive requirements with economic necessities. Soldiers who provide security for caravans without imposing excessive costs create conditions enabling profitable trading while maintaining competitive pricing. Agreements with neighboring powers that reduce military requirements through negotiation preserve resources for productive rather than destructive purposes. Innovation, emerging from exposure to foreign techniques and materials, revolutionizes production capabilities while creating new categories of exportable goods. Advances in metalworking improve tool and weapon quality, establishing technical superiority, providing competitive advantages in multiple markets. Improvements in agriculture increase productivity while reducing labor requirements, creating surpluses that support growing populations and fund expansion. Mastery of tongues transforms traders into living bridges between civilizations. Merchants who conduct negotiations in Chinese ideographs, Aramaic script, and Greek letters enable not merely exchange of goods, but transmission of ideas, techniques, and artistic styles across distances armies cannot traverse. Such abilities make them indispensable intermediaries whose services command premium fees throughout the known world. Tolerance born of practical wisdom rather than abstract philosophy characterizes their approach to diverse beliefs. When caravans welcome fire worshippers, monks, pilgrims, and shamans, they create neutral ground where business proceeds without spiritual friction. Shrines honoring multiple deities provide rest stops where travelers find familiar comfort, regardless of divine allegiances, while festivals blending diverse traditions strengthen bonds between communities, depending on cooperation for survival. Evolution, occurring during this period of intensive contact between diverse populations, creates tools necessary for communication across boundaries that politics cannot erase. Vocabularies incorporating technical terms from multiple sources enable precision in describing goods, services, and concepts that no single tradition could express adequately. Scripts adapting foreign characters to local sounds provide written communication, transcending ethnic and theological divisions. Developments reflecting growing sophistication in theological thinking accommodate diverse spiritual traditions without abandoning essential principles. Synthesis, emerging from encounters between Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and local beliefs, creates forms of worship satisfying deep spiritual needs while maintaining practical utility for communities, depending on cooperation across boundaries. As the 6th century approaches its conclusion, foundations exist for achievements that will establish these merchants as the dominant force throughout Central Asia and beyond. Networks that currently serve regional markets possess the structure and accumulated expertise necessary for expansion into truly international operations. Synthesis that creates social cohesion provides human resources capable of managing complex enterprises across vast distances and diverse populations. wisdom that maintains independence while cultivating profitable relationships with multiple powers, creates strategic flexibility, enabling survival and prosperity, regardless of which empire temporarily dominates neighboring territories. Innovations that maximize efficiency while minimizing risks provide sustainable competitive advantages, ensuring long-term success even when short-term disruptions interrupt normal operations. Seeds of empire lie ready to sprout when favorable conditions return to regions that have known too much warfare and uncertainty. What has been built during these centuries of patient development provides everything necessary for dominion that will reshape the ancient world's understanding of wealth, power, and the possibilities that emerge when human ingenuity focuses on creation rather than destruction. Through the gates of Chang'an, where the greatest city on earth spreads beneath morning skies like a golden tapestry woven from 1,000,000 dreams, comes a procession that turns heads and stops conversations in markets that have seen wonders from every corner of the known world. Caravans bearing the distinctive banners of Samarkand wind through streets where poets compose verses and emperors hold court, their laden camels swaying beneath burdens of silk and silver, ivory and jade, while guards in scale armor ride beside treasures that could ransom kingdoms. At the head of this magnificent train rides an Lushan, his eyes sharp as falcon's gaze, as he surveys the capital that will become both his triumph and his doom. Born to a mother who knew the freedom of Samarkand's markets and a father who served in imperial armies, he embodies the synthesis that characterizes this golden age, when East meets West in profitable embrace. His very presence speaks of possibilities that earlier generations could barely imagine. A man whose ancestry flows from Central Asian oases, now commanding respect in palaces where dragons coil around pillars of jade. Emperor Xuanzong receives these foreign dignitaries in halls where incense smoke carries prayers toward heaven, and courtiers dressed in robes that shimmer like captured starlight bow, before authority that spans from Korea's mountains to Vietnam's deltas. The gifts that ambassadors present, white horses whose beauty makes poets weep, dancing girls whose grace surpasses earthly bounds, musicians whose melodies seem borrowed from celestial spheres, create impressions that echo through chronicles written by scribes who struggle to capture magnificence in mere words. Behind these ceremonial displays flows commerce that enriches both empire and trading partners, with wealth beyond counting. Silver that once lay hidden in Central Asian mountains now fills Tang treasuries, while Chinese silk flows westward through passes where merchants brave bandits and blizzards for profits that justify any risk. Each successful expedition strengthens bonds between peoples separated by deserts and mountains, but united by understanding that prosperity shared becomes prosperity multiplied. The merchants who orchestrate these exchanges gather in wine shops that cluster throughout Chang'an's trading quarters, their establishments echoing with laughter in a dozen tongues as proprietors from distant oases serve vintages that bring tears of joy to customers accustomed to rice wine's gentle embrace. These venues become gathering places where information flows more freely than any beverage, where news from Samarkand reaches imperial ears before official dispatches arrive, where gossip from Constantinople mingles with rumors from Kashgar, in conversations that shape policies affecting 3 continents. Such cosmopolitan mingling inevitably influences the imperial court itself. Lady Wei adjusts the unfamiliar weight of trousers beneath her silk robes, her ladies-in-waiting giggling as they attempt to master garments that enable movement their court dresses never allowed. What began as curiosity about foreign fashions transforms into revolution as palace women abandon traditional Chinese clothing for kaftans that once clothed merchants crossing windswept steppes. Their competition to display exotic elegance spreads through every level of society until tailors struggle to meet demand for styles that arrived with the last caravan from Bukhara. This fashion revolution extends beyond mere clothing to encompass entertainment that transforms imperial celebrations. In courtyards where cherry blossoms drift like snow and goldfish swim in pools reflecting painted pavilions, dancing masters who arrived with trading caravans teach movements that create spectacles rivaling any performance the ancient world has produced. Young performers spin until earth and sky blur into golden streams, their bodies moving to rhythms that make hearts race like galloping horses across endless steppes. Musicians whose instruments sing songs learned beside oasis fires find eager students among Chinese performers who recognize genius regardless of its origins. Master Lo plucks strings stretched across a frame carved from wood that grows only in specific valleys, the melodies that emerge haunting memory long after the last notes fade into silence. His pupils struggle to master techniques that require not merely finger dexterity, but understanding of scales that divide octaves differently than any Chinese tradition teaches. The drums that arrived strapped to camelbacks now beat new rhythms in palace halls, their voices carved from trees that drink water from underground rivers flowing beneath desert sands. When imperial orchestras incorporate these foreign instruments into performances celebrating successful campaigns and prosperous harvests, they create music that captures both the grandeur of Tang power and the exotic allure of distant lands that fuel imperial wealth. Such artistic fusion reflects deeper social transformations occurring throughout the empire. Marriage negotiations that begin in wine shops conclude in ceremonies that bind merchant families to Chinese nobility, creating bloodlines carrying the heritage of two civilizations in their veins. When an Lushan weds the daughter of a Tang general, their union symbolizes more than personal affection. It represents the possibility that walls between peoples exist only in minds too narrow to encompass humanity's full potential. Children born of such alliances inherit advantages that enable them to navigate both societies with equal skill, speaking court language with palace-born fluency, while understanding caravan customs with instincts inherited from nomadic ancestors. These hybrid aristocrats become bridges spanning continents, their very existence proving that synthesis creates strength rather than confusion. Verkak, known in Chinese records as Shi Jun, exemplifies the heights such fusion can achieve. His mansion in Xi'an hosts gatherings where Persian poetry mingles with Chinese philosophy in conversations that enrich both traditions. When death finally claims him, his funeral procession winds through streets lined with mourners who weep for a man who belonged fully to two worlds without betraying either. The tomb that houses his remains tells stories that future generations will struggle to interpret. Stone carvers working on his sarcophagus create compositions where Persian hunting scenes share space with Buddhist imagery and Chinese dragons in arrangements that celebrate harmony rather than confusion, creative fusion rather than collision. The artisans who shape these narratives in stone produce art that reflects the sophisticated character of lives lived at the intersection of civilizations. Burial chambers throughout the empire preserve similar evidence of this remarkable synthesis. Zoroastrian fire altars rest beside Buddhist lotus blossoms, and Confucian virtue symbols in arrangements that reflect theological sophistication rare in any age. Golden vessels that once graced tables bear designs honoring ancestors from Samarkand, while acknowledging adoption into Tang nobility, their craftsmanship speaking to artistic standards that transcend ethnic boundaries. The administrative systems that govern these diverse populations require officials capable of navigating complex relationships. Sabao administrators, who oversee foreign communities within Chinese cities, develop skills that emperors come to value highly. Zhang Xuan, appointed to govern the Western Merchants' Quarter, maintains order among populations speaking a dozen languages, while ensuring steady flow of tribute and trade goods that fill imperial treasuries. His court becomes a model of justice that attracts settlers from throughout Central Asia. This expertise proves equally valuable in military affairs. Tang armies that march beneath banners bearing imperial dragons count cavalry among their most effective units. Horsemen whose ancestors learned warfare on steppes, where survival depended on speed and accuracy. General Li watches these foreign allies demonstrate mounted archery techniques that surpass anything Chinese tradition can provide, their arrows finding targets at distances that astound observers accustomed to infantry warfare. When these horsemen charge enemy formations, their war cries echo across battlefields in languages that Chinese soldiers cannot understand, but whose meaning becomes clear through results. Enemies who face such attacks speak in later years of demons that appeared from nowhere to strike like lightning, before vanishing into dust clouds that swallowed pursuing armies. The fortifications that guard Empire's western frontiers incorporate knowledge gained from such warfare. Master Chen studies plans drawn by foreign advisors who learned their craft in conflicts where walls either held or cities died. Their expertise purchased with blood spilled on battlefields where mercy was weakness and failure meant death. The defensive innovations they introduce, towers positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, gates designed to channel attackers into killing zones, sally ports that enable surprise counterattacks, transform Chinese military architecture. Weapons forged in Chang'an's armories reflect similar influences. Smith Wang examines a blade brought by merchants from Samarkand, its edge holding sharpness that his best steel cannot match. The foreign craftsman who teaches him improved techniques demands payment in silver rather than honor, understanding that knowledge possesses value that emperors recognize through generous compensation. Such exchanges gradually improve the quality of arms that equip imperial forces. These military and technological innovations support diplomatic relationships that extend far beyond simple tributary arrangements. Ambassador Feng returns from Bukhara carrying agreements that establish trading privileges and cooperation. His success measured not in territories conquered, but in relationships cultivated. The treaties he negotiates create frameworks enabling profitable partnerships that endure through dynastic changes and territorial adjustments that might otherwise disrupt commerce. Letters preserved in imperial archives reveal the complexity of these relationships, speaking of alliances based on mutual benefit rather than one-sided submission. Such partnerships serve strategic interests while respecting the autonomy that proud peoples will not surrender, regardless of pressure applied against their independence. The tributary missions that arrive annually in Chang'an demonstrate the fruits of such careful diplomacy. Acrobats from Samarkand perform feats that defy gravity, while musicians from Kucha play melodies that transport listeners to realms where earthly concerns fade into insignificance. Dancers whose movements tell stories of distant lands create spectacles that celebrate Empire's cosmopolitan character, their performances reminding audiences how vast and varied the world beyond their borders remains. Palace entertainments that showcase these diverse talents become occasions for displaying the Empire's cultural sophistication. When the Emperor celebrates his birthday, the program includes acts spanning continents. Persian fire dancers, Indian snake charmers, Central Asian horsemen who shoot arrows while standing on galloping mounts. their skills creating memories that guests treasure for lifetimes. The artistic workshops that produce decorations for such occasions employ craftsmen whose techniques combine traditions that once existed in isolation. Painter Zhou learns to render Central Asian horses with Chinese brushwork, his scrolls capturing both accurate anatomy and spiritual essence that makes viewers feel wind rushing through their hair. The foreign horsemen who pose for his studies share knowledge of equine behavior that transforms mere pictures into living portraits. Sculptors working in imperial workshops create similar syntheses. When Master Li shapes a bodhisattva's features, he draws inspiration from models whose cheekbones carry the memory of steppes and whose eyes hold the wisdom of desert crossings, creating sacred images that welcome worshippers from every corner of the known world. These artistic achievements reflect broader patterns of spiritual development occurring throughout the empire. Monasteries that welcome Central Asian pilgrims become centers where Sanskrit scholarship mingles with Chinese philosophy to produce insights enriching both traditions. Abbot Xuanzang debates theological questions with visiting monks whose understanding of Buddhist texts stems from direct contact with Indian masters, their discussions creating syntheses that influence thinking throughout the Buddhist world. Fire temples that serve merchant communities maintain ancient practices while adapting to new environments. Priest Miehe tends sacred flames that have burned since his grandfather's time. The fire fed with wood brought from forests that grow around Samarkand's oases, each log carrying the scent of home to worshippers who live in foreign lands but remember their origins. The prosperity that enables such diverse spiritual communities also drives innovations in commerce. Father Alopen, who conducts Christian services that blend Western liturgy with Eastern sensibilities, finds his congregation includes wealthy merchants who support his mission through generous donations. These same traders rely on banking networks that transfer funds between distant cities, eliminating delays that once prevented timely responses to market opportunities. Merchant Liu deposits silver in Chang'an and withdraws equivalent value in Samarkand months later, the transaction recorded in ledgers that create financial instruments spanning continents. Such innovations enable commerce on scales that previous generations could barely imagine, their efficiency supporting the very prosperity that allows diverse religious communities to flourish. The standardization that makes such transactions possible extends throughout the commercial system. When traders argue over quantities, they refer to standards maintained in imperial bureaus whose authority both parties accept. Coins whose purity and weight remain consistent across vast territories create trust, enabling long-term contracts and deferred payments, their reliability supporting networks that carry more than mere goods between civilizations. Ideas originating in Greek philosophy, Persian theology, or Indian spirituality find audiences in Chinese cities where scholars hungry for knowledge eagerly embrace wisdom regardless of its source. Artistic techniques that develop in one region spread rapidly along trading paths to influence craftsmen who have never traveled beyond their native villages, their adoption creating artistic languages that transcend ethnic boundaries. Knowledge flows with equal freedom in the opposite direction. Paper-making techniques that Chinese artisans once guarded jealously spread westward through networks carrying other precious secrets. Master craftsmen who teach improved methods to foreign students understand that knowledge shared multiplies rather than diminishes. Their willingness to train competitors, creating relationships that benefit everyone involved in expanding markets. Silk production methods that give Chinese weavers competitive advantages gradually become known to foreign craftsmen who adapt these techniques to local materials and preferences. When merchants carry samples of superior textiles to distant markets, they inevitably attract customers who want to learn production secrets, their curiosity creating opportunities for those wise enough to profit from teaching rather than hoarding knowledge. But under the bright sheen of prosperity and bustling exchange, pressure builds quietly, like molten rock waiting to rise. And Lucian, whose rise through imperial ranks seemed to prove that talent could overcome any barrier of birth or ancestry, starts harboring ambitions that grow larger and more dangerous with each promotion. His understanding of both Chinese military organization and Central Asian fighting techniques creates knowledge that could serve empire loyally or destroy it from within. Discontent festers among generals who see foreign-born commanders receiving honors they believe should reward native talent. Their resentment burns hotter when they watch Lucian's continued advancement, his success seeming to mock their own achievements while proving that imperial favor flows toward those who possess skills they cannot match or understand. Jealousy spreads beyond military circles to courtiers who observe merchants accumulating wealth and influence through activities that challenge traditional sources of power. Silver flows from imperial treasuries, like water through broken dams, as nobles compete to purchase exotic goods that demonstrate their sophistication. The spending creating dependencies that strengthen foreign partners while weakening domestic foundations. Traditionalists who fear that Chinese identity dilutes through excessive contact with foreign influences begin organizing resistance to changes they cannot prevent but refuse to accept. Fashions celebrating exotic origins challenge dress codes that once distinguished social ranks and ethnic boundaries, while music incorporating foreign melodies and instruments competes with classical forms that carried cultural meaning for centuries. These concerns extend to spiritual matters, as temples serving diverse communities require governmental policies that balance competing demands for support and protection. Festivals celebrating foreign customs challenge calendar systems that once provided predictable rhythms for agricultural and ceremonial activities, their popularity forcing adaptations that disturb conservatives who prefer familiar patterns. As the 8th century reaches its midpoint, the magnificent synthesis that created this golden age begins showing signs of strain that will eventually shatter its foundations. Success that brought prosperity and prestige also creates vulnerabilities that enemies and rivals will exploit when opportunities arise. The very cosmopolitan character that defines Tang greatness, containing seeds of instability that threaten everything these generations built through patient cultivation of international relationships. Storm clouds gather on horizons that still seem bright to observers who judge present conditions by immediate appearances rather than underlying trends. What has been achieved during this extraordinary period will not disappear entirely when crisis comes, but it will transform into something different, something preserving essential elements while adapting to changed circumstances that no amount of wisdom or wealth can prevent. Blood pools in palace courtyards where cherry blossoms once drifted like snow, their pale petals now stained crimson with the dreams of dynasties torn apart by ambition too large for any single heart to contain. And Lucian stands among the carnage he has created, his eyes no longer holding the calculating sharpness that once impressed emperors, but burning with madness that consumes men who mistake conquest for achievement. The rebellion that bears his name sweeps across the empire like wildfire through drought-stricken forests, leaving behind ruins where prosperity once flourished and graves where families once gathered to celebrate harvests that will never come again. Chang'an burns as rebels storm through streets that echoed with laughter, from wine shops now reduced to ash and memory. The cosmopolitan quarters where merchants from Samarkand conducted business with Chinese nobles, become battlegrounds where neighbors turn against neighbors, where the synthesis that created golden ages transforms into the suspicion that destroys civilizations. Flames consume libraries that preserved wisdom from 3 continents, while smoke carries away the dreams of generations who believed that walls between peoples existed only in minds too narrow to encompass humanity's potential. Emperor Xuanzong flees his capital like a common thief, abandoning a house he can no longer defend. His imperial robes exchanged for the rough clothing of refugees who stream along roads that once carried tribute from grateful provinces. Behind him lies everything his dynasty built through centuries of patient cultivation. The palaces where foreign ambassadors presented gifts, the gardens where court ladies danced to melodies learned from distant oases, the workshops where craftsmen blended techniques that spanned continents to create beauty that seemed destined to endure forever. The rebellion that tears apart this carefully constructed world reveals how fragile the bonds holding diverse peoples together truly were. Generals who once served beside foreign allies now question the loyalty of any man whose ancestry flows from beyond the empire's borders. Courtiers who competed to display exotic fashions suddenly find such preferences branded as evidence of treasonous sympathies. The very cosmopolitan character that defined Tang greatness becomes liability in times when survival requires choosing sides rather than building bridges. And Lushan's forces, swollen with recruits who see opportunity in chaos, march through provinces that welcomed foreign merchants for generations. Their advance marks the beginning of changes that will reshape not merely political arrangements, but the fundamental assumptions underlying commercial relationships that connected civilizations. Cities that opened their gates to caravans bearing goods from distant lands now close them against armies that bring only destruction, and the bitter knowledge that trust, once broken, requires generations to rebuild. Yet even as imperial armies rally to contain the rebellion, events unfold in distant lands that will prove equally devastating to the networks that sustained prosperity. Beyond the western mountains where eagles nest and wolves hunt, where caravan routes wind through passes that have echoed with the bells of pack animals for centuries, forces gather that will transform the political landscape of Central Asia as surely as Lushan's madness reshapes the Chinese world. In the valley of Talas, where 2 rivers converge like destinies meeting at crossroads of empire, armies prepare for collision that will determine whether Chinese influence extends westward or retreats behind barriers of mountain and desert. General Gao Xianji leads Tang forces that include the finest cavalry Central Asia can provide. Horsemen whose ancestors served the dynasty faithfully through decades of profitable alliance. Their enemies approach from lands where the crescent moon has replaced older symbols of divine authority, where new forms of faith inspire warriors who fight with conviction that paradise awaits those who die, advancing the cause of truth. The battle that erupts along these riverbanks echoes with war cries in languages that span continents, as Chinese steel meets Arabian iron in combat that will reshape the balance of power throughout the known world. Horses scream and men fall, while banners torn by desert winds flutter over ground that drinks blood from warriors who will never see their homelands again. When dust settles and vultures gather to feast on consequences that no general foresaw, the defeated Chinese find themselves prisoners of enemies who speak of mercy in words they do not understand, but whose meaning becomes clear through actions that spare lives while ending dreams. Among the captives who march westward in chains forged from their own weapons, walk craftsmen whose skills will spread beyond their captors' original intentions. Papermakers who once served imperial workshops find themselves teaching techniques that Chinese artisans guarded for centuries, their knowledge flowing like water through networks that carry innovations faster than armies can march. The secrets they share under duress become gifts that enrich civilizations their ancestors never imagined, transforming defeat into unexpected legacy that influences development throughout the Western world. The victory that establishes Arab authority over territories once ruled from Chang'an creates new realities that reshape commercial relationships throughout Central Asia. Merchants who built fortunes serving as intermediaries between Chinese and Western markets suddenly find themselves navigating political arrangements that favor different partnerships and reward different loyalties. Caravans that once carried Tang silk toward Mediterranean shores must now negotiate with officials who serve caliphs rather than emperors, their success dependent on adapting to customs that challenge everything they learned about conducting business across cultural boundaries. These changes prove particularly devastating for communities that thrived through careful cultivation of neutrality. Samarkand, whose merchants grew wealthy by serving all masters while submitting completely to none, discovers that new rulers demand choices that threaten the very flexibility that enabled success. The delicate balance that allowed simultaneous service to Chinese emperors and Persian shahs, Roman merchants and Indian princes, collapses under pressure from conquerors, who view such diversity as evidence of unreliable loyalty rather than sophisticated diplomacy. Bukhara's bazaars, where goods from 3 continents once changed hands in transactions that enriched entire populations, echo with the silence of commerce interrupted by warfare that makes travel dangerous and profit uncertain. Workshops that produce textiles combining techniques learned from masters across the known world stand empty as craftsmen flee toward territories that still welcome skills acquired through generations of patient learning. The synthesis that created artistic traditions rivaling anything produced in more famous centers dissolves as communities scatter like seeds blown by winds, too strong for any roots to resist. Even as political upheavals disrupt established patterns of trade and governance, deeper transformations occur that will reshape the spiritual landscape of regions that once celebrated diversity as strength rather than weakness. Islamic armies that advance through territories where Zoroastrian fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, and Christian churches serve diverse populations bring conviction that truth admits no compromise with error, that salvation requires choosing the correct path, rather than honoring multiple traditions simultaneously. In Samarkand's ancient fire temple, where flames that burned for generations finally gutter and die, Priest Mir watches the end of traditions that connected his family to ancestors whose names stretch back to the time when Alexander's armies first disturbed the peace of Central Asian valleys. The wood that once fed sacred fires now serves more practical purposes, as refugees burn whatever they can find to cook meals that may be their last before flight, carries them beyond familiar horizons toward uncertain sanctuary, in lands that may or may not welcome strangers bearing memories of vanished greatness. Buddhist monasteries that preserved Sanskrit texts and Chinese philosophical works find themselves defending intellectual treasures that new rulers consider at best irrelevant and at worst dangerous to the spiritual welfare of populations they now govern. Monks who spent lifetimes copying manuscripts that preserved wisdom, accumulated over centuries, watch helplessly as works representing generations of scholarship feed bonfires that illuminate the faces of men who cannot read the words they destroy, but understand perfectly the symbolic power of reducing competing truths to ash and smoke. Christian communities that emerged during the golden age of cosmopolitan tolerance discover that their very existence challenges assumptions underlying the new order. Father Alopan's successor leads congregations that must worship in secret, their prayers whispered in basements and hidden chambers, while soldiers patrol streets that once welcomed pilgrims from every corner of the known world. The bells that called faithful to prayer fall silent, their bronze voices melted down to create weapons that serve very different purposes than summoning souls to contemplate divine mercy. Still, conversion moves in fits and starts, far from the seamless process conquerors might desire. Many who submit to new requirements maintain older loyalties, in hearts that no amount of surveillance can penetrate completely. Former fire worshippers who perform Islamic prayers during daylight hours kindle small flames in hidden corners when darkness provides cover for rituals that connect them to traditions their ancestors would recognize. Buddhist monks who publicly accept new teachings continue copying texts in scripts that few can read, preserving knowledge for future generations who may prove more receptive to wisdom that current circumstances force underground. The gradual nature of this transformation creates communities that exist in spiritual limbo, their public conformity masking private allegiances that generate tensions threatening to explode whenever circumstances provide opportunities for expressing suppressed convictions. Families that once celebrated festivals honoring multiple traditions now navigate calendar systems that acknowledge only observances approved by authorities who measure devotion through visible compliance rather than sincere conviction. These disruptions extend beyond matters of faith to encompass every aspect of life that once flourished through connections spanning continents. The banking networks that enabled merchants to transfer funds between distant cities collapse as political instability makes long-term agreements impossible to honor. Letters of credit that once facilitated transactions across vast distances become worthless paper when the institutions that guaranteed them disappear in the chaos of conquest and rebellion. Merchant families that accumulated wealth through generations of successful trading find their fortunes evaporating like morning mist, as routes that once generated predictable profits become dangerous passages, where bandits and soldiers compete to rob caravans that venture forth despite obvious risks. The reputation for honesty that took lifetimes to establish crumbles in seasons when survival requires choices that previous generations would have considered unthinkable. Caravans that still attempt to maintain connections between surviving markets travel under heavy guard through territories where every mountain pass might conceal enemies and every oasis could become a trap. The pack animals that once moved with confidence along familiar paths now start at shadows, while their handlers scan horizons that no longer promise welcome at journey's end. Goods that commanded premium prices in prosperous times gather dust in warehouses that owners dare not approach, lest they attract attention from authorities who view wealth as evidence of suspicious connections. The disruption of these ancient networks creates ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate regions where armies clash and governments fall. Mediterranean ports that once received regular shipments of Chinese silk and Central Asian precious metals find their supplies interrupted by events occurring in lands whose names their merchants barely know. European workshops that depended on techniques learned from Eastern masters must adapt their methods to utilize materials available locally rather than exotic imports that no longer arrive with seasonal reliability. Indian Ocean traders who built businesses around transporting goods between civilizations that seemed permanently prosperous discover that political upheaval in distant territories affects their operations in ways that no amount of local knowledge can predict or prevent. Pepper and spices that once flowed northward through established channels must find new routes that bypass territories now closed to commerce. Their journeys lengthened and costs increased by necessity of avoiding regions where chaos replaces the order that enabled profitable exchange. The intellectual consequences of this disruption prove equally devastating to communities that thrived through synthesis of diverse traditions. Schools that trained young people for careers, requiring sophisticated knowledge of multiple languages and customs, find their curricula irrelevant when the positions such education once provided no longer exist. Students who mastered Chinese classics, Arabic poetry, and Persian mathematics discover that specialization serves better than versatility in times when communities turn inward rather than seeking connections with distant neighbors. Libraries that preserve texts representing the accumulated wisdom of civilizations watch their collections scatter as scholars flee toward territories that still value learning above orthodoxy. Manuscripts that survived centuries of warfare and natural disaster perish in decades of intentional destruction as new authorities prioritize ideological purity over intellectual diversity. The conversations that once occurred in cosmopolitan centers, where Eastern philosophy met Western logic, fall silent as communities lose the shared vocabularies that made such exchanges possible. Artistic traditions that flourished through combination of techniques learned from masters across continents fragment as craftsmen lose access to materials and inspiration that once flowed freely along commercial routes. Weavers who created textiles combining Chinese silk with Central Asian wool and Mediterranean dyes must content themselves with local fibers that produce fabrics beautiful in their own right, but lacking the exotic appeal that once commanded premium prices in international markets. Musicians who blended melodies, learned from performers spanning 3 continents, find their instruments gathering dust as audiences lose interest in compositions that remind them of cosmopolitan ages when the world seemed larger and more welcoming than current circumstances suggest. The scales that once enabled expression of emotions too complex for single traditions to capture give way to simpler forms that serve communities turning inward rather than reaching outward for inspiration and beauty. Even the Tang Dynasty, that once projected power across vast distances, finds itself contracting toward core territories that represent all it can realistically hope to defend. Generals who once planned campaigns that would extend Chinese influence to shores of distant seas now focus on protecting borders that shrink with each year of internal conflict and external pressure. The armies that counted foreign cavalry among their most effective units must now question the loyalty of any soldier whose ancestry traces to lands beyond immediate imperial control. Administrative systems that once governed provinces spanning continents adapt to managing territories that rarely extend beyond horizons visible from capital cities. The sophisticated bureaucracies that process tribute from grateful allies transform into defensive organizations focused on extracting resources needed for survival rather than expansion. Officials who once negotiated with ambassadors representing distant kingdoms find themselves dealing primarily with military commanders whose concerns center on maintaining order rather than fostering prosperity. The currency that once circulated throughout Central Asia as symbol of Tang prosperity finds its value questioned by merchants who prefer silver or goods to coins whose issuing authority can no longer guarantee acceptance beyond immediate borders. Mints that produced beautiful specimens bearing imperial imagery reduce their output, while debasement of precious metal content reflects the desperation of governments that must choose between maintaining standards and funding armies needed for basic survival. As the 9th century approaches its midpoint, the world that enabled cosmopolitan civilizations to flourish has contracted to isolated communities that preserve what they can of vanished greatness, while adapting to realities that previous generations could never have imagined. The networks that once carried goods, ideas, and people across continents lie broken like bridges destroyed by floods that changed the very geography they once served. Yet even in contraction and loss, seeds of future renewal lie dormant in soil, enriched by the decay of institutions that seem destined to endure forever. The knowledge that flowed along disrupted roots survives in minds and manuscripts that patient preservation may someday make available to generations more fortunate than those who watched empires crumble and civilizations scatter like leaves before winter storms that strip trees bare, but do not kill roots that may someday support fresh growth when favorable seasons return to lands that have known too much warfare and sorrow. Morning mist clings to empty courtyards where merchant princes once held council. The silence broken only by wind, whistling through chambers that echo with ghosts of negotiations that shaped the fate of continents. In Samarkand's abandoned palaces, where gold once changed hands in quantities that staggered foreign ambassadors, sand drifts through doorways that no longer admit caravans bearing treasures from distant shores. The great age of empire has passed like a fever dream, leaving behind communities that must learn to survive in a world grown smaller and more dangerous than their ancestors ever imagined possible. Rustam ibn Fazl adjusts the unfamiliar weight of a Quran in hands that once held contracts written in a dozen scripts, his morning prayers mixing Arabic phrases learned from necessity with private words whispered in the tongue his grandmother taught him beside fires that honored older gods. Around him gather men whose fathers commanded respect from Chinese emperors and Persian shahs, their beards now grey, with years spent adapting to realities that no amount of accumulated wisdom could prevent or prepare them to face with dignity intact. The mosque that rises where a fire temple once burned serves a congregation that includes descendants of families whose names appeared in imperial chronicles, their prayers ascending toward heaven through architecture that blends traditional forms with requirements imposed by faith, that conquered through conviction rather than mere force of arms. Yet beneath public conformity, private memories persist like underground streams that feed oases, where older traditions survive in forms their original practitioners might barely recognize but would not entirely disown. Such adaptations reflect the pragmatic genius that enabled survival when empires fell and certainties crumbled like walls built on foundations of sand. The merchants who once moved goods between civilizations now focus on regional markets that offer smaller profits but greater security than ventures requiring trust in authorities whose reliability cannot be guaranteed beyond immediate borders. Caravans that crossed continents become trading expeditions that rarely venture beyond territories where local reputation provides protection that distant treaties can no longer ensure. Young Ahmad ibn Nasr learns his craft in workshops where masters who once created textiles for imperial courts now weave cloth that serves the needs of customers whose tastes reflect changed circumstances rather than cosmopolitan sophistication. The techniques remain largely unchanged, patterns passed down through generations of patient refinement, but the markets that purchase finished products prefer styles that honor new sensibilities, while maintaining quality standards that preserve reputations built over lifetimes of honest dealing. Apprentices who might once have expected careers that carried them to courts where emperors dispensed favor, like rain-nourishing distant gardens, now prepare for lives spent serving communities that measure success in survival rather than expansion. Their education includes not merely technical skills required for their trades, but languages and customs needed for conducting business in a world where the wrong word or gesture might transform profitable negotiation into dangerous misunderstanding. The routes that remain viable follow paths that connect markets where demand persists, despite political upheavals that disrupted grander networks. Silk continues flowing westward, though in quantities that represent luxury for individual customers rather than state purchases that once filled imperial treasuries. Precious metals still move eastward, their value enhanced by scarcity created when mining operations ceased in territories too dangerous for sustained commercial exploitation. Caravans that attempt these journeys travel under protection arrangements that would have seemed impossible during the Golden Age, when imperial guarantees ensured safe passage across vast distances. Local strongmen who control strategic passes demand tribute that cuts deeply into profit margins, while providing security that enables completion of journeys that might otherwise end in graves, marked only by scattered bones bleaching under desert suns. The guides who lead these expeditions possess knowledge accumulated through lifetimes spent navigating territories where political boundaries shift with seasonal regularity, and yesterday's allies become tomorrow's enemies without warning or explanation. Their understanding of tribal relationships, water sources, and seasonal hazards represents wisdom that cannot be learned from maps or books, but requires experience purchased through dangers that claim those who trust too readily in luck or outdated information. Pack animals chosen for these reduced operations emphasize endurance over capacity, their loads carefully selected to include only goods that command prices justifying risks that increase with every mile traveled beyond familiar territories. Camels that once carried luxury items destined for imperial palaces now bear practical merchandise that serves basic needs of populations whose priorities focus on survival rather than display of wealth or sophistication. The trading posts that dot surviving routes adapt their facilities to serve smaller expeditions while maintaining standards that encourage repeat business from merchants who cannot afford to waste resources on establishments that fail to provide value commensurate with fees charged. Innkeepers who once hosted diplomatic missions now cater to commercial travelers whose requirements remain substantial despite reduced circumstances that characterize contemporary commerce. Such establishments become centers where information flows with greater freedom than any official channels permit, their common rooms echoing with conversations that reveal which territories welcome foreign merchants and which regard strangers with suspicion that makes business impossible, regardless of goods offered or prices proposed. Knowledge of current conditions becomes as valuable as any commodity, its possession often determining whether expeditions return with profits or perish in attempting to reach markets that no longer exist. With commerce diminished, these communities craft systems that reflect their needs, leaving behind the oversized structures once meant for more ambitious times. Local councils replace imperial bureaucracies in making decisions that affect daily life, their authority deriving from demonstrated competence in managing practical problems rather than abstract theories of governance inherited from vanished empires. Judges who settle disputes apply laws that blend traditional customs with requirements imposed by new rulers, their decisions creating precedents that enable communities to function, despite lacking clear guidance from higher authorities, who may not understand local conditions or care about outcomes that affect only small populations. The wisdom they accumulate through resolving conflicts becomes part of inheritance passed to successors who must navigate similar challenges with fewer resources and greater uncertainty. Schools that once prepared students for careers in imperial service now focus on skills needed for life in communities that must rely primarily on their own resources rather than support from distant capitals. Children learn mathematics required for conducting business, languages needed for communicating with neighbors who speak different tongues, and crafts that enable self-sufficiency when imports become unavailable or prohibitively expensive. The education they receive emphasizes adaptability over specialization, understanding that survival requires ability to perform multiple functions rather than expertise in single areas that may become irrelevant when circumstances change without warning. Teachers who once instructed future diplomats and administrators now train young people for lives that may require relocating repeatedly as political conditions make some territories uninhabitable, while others offer opportunities for those brave enough to accept uncertainty as permanent condition. Religious life in these communities reflects similar adaptations, as institutions adjust to serving populations whose spiritual needs must be met through local resources, rather than support from distant centers of learning or authority. Mosques that replace earlier places of worship maintain essential functions while adapting architectural forms to materials available locally and customs that honor both new requirements and older sensibilities that communities cannot entirely abandon without losing identity. Imams who lead congregations often possess knowledge acquired through study in centers that no longer exist or have become inaccessible due to political upheavals that make travel dangerous for religious scholars whose loyalty might be questioned by authorities representing competing interpretations of divine will. Their sermons blend orthodox teachings with insights drawn from experiences that enable survival in circumstances that theoretical education cannot adequately address. The festivals that mark religious calendar provide opportunities for communities to express identity while adapting traditions to requirements imposed by faith that conquered through conviction rather than compromise. Celebrations that once honored multiple traditions evolve into observances that satisfy new expectations, while preserving elements that connect participants to ancestors whose memories survive in stories told beside fires that burn wood, gathered from forests planted by hands now dust. Marriage customs that once reflected connections spanning continents adapt to circumstances where suitable partners must be found within reduced territories that may not include individuals whose backgrounds meet traditional expectations for maintaining family status or commercial relationships. Young people whose ancestors married for alliances that served imperial purposes now choose spouses based on personal compatibility and practical considerations that enable survival rather than advancement. Children born of these unions inherit identities that blend heritage, preserved through oral tradition, with adaptations required for life in communities that honor the past, while acknowledging that future prosperity depends on flexibility rather than rigid adherence to customs designed for circumstances that no longer exist. Their education prepares them for lives that may require abandoning familiar territories if conditions deteriorate beyond tolerance levels that each family must determine for itself. The trades that support these communities emphasize production of goods that serve essential needs rather than luxury items that require exotic materials or techniques known only to masters whose knowledge died with empires that once supported such specialization. Smiths who once created decorative weapons for ceremonial purposes now forge tools needed for agriculture and basic crafts that enable self-sufficiency when imported implements become unavailable. Weavers who produce textiles combining techniques learned from masters across continents now create cloth that serves practical needs while maintaining quality standards that preserve reputations built through generations of honest work. Their patterns may lack the exotic appeal that once commanded premium prices in international markets, but they possess beauty that speaks to souls seeking comfort in familiar forms, rather than excitement generated by constant novelty. Potters who shaped vessels using clays imported from distant deposits now work with local materials that require different techniques, but produce ceramics that serve daily needs, while demonstrating artistic sensibilities that connect current production to traditions that stretch back through centuries of patient refinement. They're kilns, fire pieces that may never travel beyond regional markets, but carry forward aesthetic principles that define identity even when political structures collapse. The workshops where these craftsmen labor become centers of knowledge preservation as masters train apprentices in skills that might otherwise disappear when circumstances prevent normal transmission of techniques from generation to generation. The wisdom they share includes not merely practical knowledge required for producing goods, but understanding of principles that enable adaptation when materials or tools become unavailable due to disruptions that affect supply chains. Such institutions serve functions that extend beyond their immediate commercial purposes, as gathering places where community members share information, discuss problems, and coordinate responses to challenges that require collective action rather than individual initiative. The relationships formed through daily interaction in productive activities create social bonds that support communities. When external threats require unified response or internal disputes need resolution through negotiation rather than violence. Women who once managed households that included servants drawn from across the known world now supervise families that depend primarily on their own labor rather than assistance from others whose services can be purchased with wealth accumulated through commercial success. Their responsibilities expand to include skills that previous generations could delegate to specialists whose expertise commanded respect throughout regions where reputations traveled faster than caravans bearing goods. The knowledge they possess becomes crucial for survival as communities turn inward to discover resources that enable self-sufficiency when external supplies become unreliable or unavailable due to disruptions that affect networks spanning continents. Their understanding of food preservation, textile production, and household management represents wisdom that enables families to maintain living standards despite reduced circumstances that challenge assumptions about what constitutes necessary versus luxury consumption. Gardens that once displayed exotic plants imported for their novelty or beauty now focus on vegetables and herbs that provide nutrition and medicine needed for maintaining health. When professional healers become unavailable, or their services too expensive for ordinary families to afford, the women who tend these plots possess botanical knowledge that includes understanding of which plants thrive in local conditions and which combinations provide balanced nutrition throughout seasonal cycles. Medical knowledge that once depended on remedies utilizing ingredients imported from distant lands adapts to rely on plants and minerals available locally. Their effectiveness demonstrated through generations of use by populations that survived without access to exotic treatments that once served elite patients. Healers who practice in these communities learn to combine traditional techniques with innovations developed through necessity when familiar remedies become unavailable. The libraries that preserve written knowledge adapt their collections to serve immediate needs, rather than maintaining comprehensive archives that require resources these communities cannot spare, for purposes that may seem abstract when survival requires practical focus. Books that survive selection processes emphasize works that provide useful information, rather than theoretical knowledge that may lack immediate application to problems that demand urgent solutions. Scribes who once copied texts in multiple languages now focus on preserving essential works in scripts that local populations can read, their efforts ensuring that crucial knowledge survives even when sophisticated educational institutions disappear due to lack of resources needed for supporting advanced learning. The manuscripts they produce may lack the artistic sophistication that characterized production during more prosperous periods, but they serve essential functions in preserving information that enables communities to maintain capabilities beyond basic survival. As the 10th century approaches, these scattered communities represent the remnants of civilizations that once projected influence across continents, but now concentrate their energies on preserving what they can of inherited wisdom while adapting to realities that previous generations could never have imagined. The networks that connected them to distant markets and sources of knowledge have contracted to relationships that rarely extend beyond territories that can be reached safely within seasonal travel cycles. Within these narrowed conditions, potential still lingers, dormant, like roots waiting for the warmth and light that will allow them to grow. The skills that survive in workshops and the knowledge preserved in libraries and living memory represent resources that future generations may utilize when political stability returns to regions that have known too much warfare and uncertainty. The children who grow up in these communities inherit both the memory of vanished greatness and the practical wisdom needed for survival in circumstances that require different skills than their ancestors possessed. Their education prepares them for lives that may witness the emergence of new forms of prosperity if they possess the patience and wisdom needed for building on foundations that adversity has tested but not destroyed. Hope persists in hearts that remember when caravans carried dreams as well as goods across distances that seemed to promise infinite possibilities for those brave enough to venture beyond familiar horizons. Though current circumstances limit such ambitions, the spirit that enabled earlier achievements survives in forms that may someday prove capable of supporting fresh attempts at connecting isolated communities into networks that serve purposes larger than mere survival. Desert winds carry the last echoes of spoken Sogdian through valleys where caravans once gathered like rivers converging toward the sea, their voices fading into silence that swallows centuries of accumulated wisdom, like sand consuming footprints of travelers who will never return. In remote mountain villages where grandfathers still remember phrases their own grandfathers taught them, old men gather around evening fires to share words that fewer and fewer children understand, their tongues forming sounds that connect them to ancestors whose names have become legends, whispered in languages that grow more foreign with each passing season. Mahmud ibn Ibrahim closes the ledger where his grandfather recorded transactions in scripts that blend Arabic letters with symbols inherited from merchants whose caravans once carried Chinese silk toward Roman shores. The ink has faded to brown stains that barely distinguish themselves from parchment that crumbles at his touch, yet the numbers still speak of profits earned through ventures that required courage to cross distances. His own children cannot imagine traveling without armies, to guarantee safe passage through territories that once welcomed strangers bearing goods from distant lands. The workshop where he learned his craft now echoes with simpler rhythms of production that serves only local needs. His apprentices weave cloth using patterns that honor traditions, stretching back through centuries, while adapting to materials available within territories that can be reached safely before winter. Snows close mountain passes. These same young men study under masters who speak of techniques acquired in courts that served emperors, though such knowledge increasingly seems as distant as the stars that guided their ancestors across deserts now too dangerous to traverse. Young Hassan represents this transformation in living form. He speaks only Arabic in markets where his grandfather once negotiated in tongues that enabled communication with customers, whose homelands lay beyond any horizon visible from these mountain settlements. The languages that once connected civilizations survive only in prayers, whispered by old women who learned their words from mothers. whose own mothers remembered when such knowledge opened doors to opportunities spanning continents, rather than merely enabling conversation with neighbors who share similar circumstances. Persian poetry flows from his lips, carrying echoes of older rhythms that shaped the consciousness of merchants whose caravans brought more than goods between cultures, eager to learn from each other's achievements. The verses he recites at wedding celebrations speak of love and loss, in metaphors that honor traditions extending back through generations, while expressing emotions that transcend boundaries, separating peoples who once viewed differences as sources of strength rather than causes for suspicion. The stories he tells children gathered around fires blend historical memory with mythical imagination. Heroes whose adventures occurred in lands that exist now only in tales grow larger with each retelling until they become legends that preserve essential truths about courage and wisdom, even when historical accuracy yields to the more pressing need for inspiration that enables survival through circumstances testing the strongest spirits. Abd al-Rahman ibn Yusuf serves as guardian of written wisdom that connects these oral traditions to vanished libraries. He runs his finger along lines of text that his great-grandfather copied from masters, whose learning originated in centers that no longer exist, except in memory, preserved by manuscripts growing more precious, as the number of people capable of reading them diminishes with each generation. The knowledge they contain includes techniques for working metal, growing crops, and conducting negotiations that served merchants whose success depended on understanding human nature across boundaries that seemed insurmountable to those who lacked patience for learning foreign ways. His children learn from these preserved texts, though their education focuses on Arabic and Persian rather than scripts that once enabled correspondence with partners scattered across continents. Their schooling prepares them for lives that will unfold within territories where international knowledge provides little practical advantage over skills serving immediate needs of communities that must rely primarily on their own resources rather than wealth accumulated through ventures, requiring trust in distant authorities. The schools where they study have adapted their mission to serve changed circumstances. Teachers who once instructed future diplomats and international traders now focus on religious instruction that provides moral guidance while preserving enough secular knowledge to enable participation in commerce serving regional markets, rather than networks that once connected civilizations separated by vast distances. These educators possess learning acquired in institutions that modified their curricula to serve populations whose aspirations necessarily remain more modest than those of ancestors who dreamed of ventures spanning oceans. Tombs scattered throughout mountain graveyards tell similar stories of adaptation and loss. Monuments that mark the final resting places of merchant princes who once commanded audiences with emperors and shahs bear inscriptions that fewer visitors can read with each passing year, their carved surfaces telling stories in languages that grow more obscure as communities abandon scripts requiring extensive education for mastery. The monuments themselves remain impressive in their scale and craftsmanship, yet they speak increasingly to stones and sky, rather than human audiences capable of understanding the achievements they commemorate. Graveyards that once received mourners from territories spanning continents now serve populations that rarely include individuals whose connections extend beyond familiar valleys. Ceremonies that honor the dead blend traditions inherited from ancestors with requirements imposed by faith that conquered through conviction rather than compromise. The prayers spoken over graves mix Arabic phrases learned from necessity with older words that survive in hearts, even when tongues struggle to pronounce sounds connecting the living to the dead across chasms that time creates between generations. Children born into these transformed communities inherit names that reflect their dual heritage. Islamic tradition combines with memories of ancestors whose achievements become more legendary with each retelling, their identities reflecting synthesis that characterizes peoples who must choose between preserving heritage and adapting to circumstances that reward conformity over diversity. Their future prospects depend more on ability to function within reduced territories than on skills that once enabled ventures requiring knowledge of languages and customs spanning the known world. The trade routes that once carried their ancestors' goods toward markets in Constantinople and Beijing have been repurposed to serve different needs. These paths now accommodate primarily pilgrims, whose journeys aim towards spiritual rather than commercial destinations. Caravanserais that hosted merchants from 3 continents provide shelter for travelers whose purposes include devotion to obligations that transcend ethnic boundaries while serving economic needs that remain modest compared to enterprises that once required coordination across vast distances and diverse political jurisdictions. Merchants who still attempt long-distance ventures face obstacles that would have seemed insurmountable to ancestors who conducted business when imperial guarantees ensured safe passage. The goods they carry emphasize necessities over luxuries, their profits measured in survival rather than accumulation of wealth, enabling expansion into markets requiring investments too large for individual families to risk, when failure might result in destruction rather than mere financial loss. Banking systems that once facilitated these grand enterprises have contracted to serve local needs exclusively. Networks that enabled transfer of funds between distant cities survive only as arrangements serving communities, whose relationships rarely extend beyond territories, where personal reputation provides security that distant institutions cannot guarantee. Letters of credit that facilitated transactions across continents become meaningless when the authorities that guaranteed them disappear or lose capacity to honor commitments that assumed stability, lasting longer than seasonal cycles governing agricultural production and trading opportunities. Currency reflects these reduced circumstances as coins bearing images of vanished rulers continue circulating based on metal content rather than political authority that issued them. Value gets determined by markets that measure wealth in terms transcending dynastic claims carved on surfaces that grow smoother with each transaction. Local authorities maintain sufficient control to guarantee weights and purity that enable confidence in exchange rates, but acceptance rarely extends beyond immediate territories, where such guarantees carry meaning. Craft production has likewise adapted to serve transformed markets. Guilds that once maintained standards recognized throughout international commerce now create items addressing practical needs of populations whose purchasing power reflects reduced circumstances rather than wealth, accumulated through participation in networks connecting the known world. The beauty they achieve speaks to souls seeking comfort in familiar forms, rather than excitement generated by constant exposure to exotic influences that once characterized urban centers, where cultures met and mingled in daily interactions. Workshops that produced goods commanding premium prices in distant markets focus on quality that honors inherited principles while utilizing materials available locally. Weavers create textiles that serve daily needs while maintaining artistic standards, demonstrating their connection to traditions stretching back through centuries. Their patterns may lack exotic appeal that once commanded premium prices in international markets, but they possess beauty, speaking to hearts that find meaning in continuity rather than constant change. Religious institutions have undergone perhaps the most visible transformation. Mosques that replaced earlier places of worship maintain architectural elements echoing older sensibilities while adapting forms to requirements imposed by orthodox interpretation of divine will, that brooks no compromise with practices suggesting divided loyalty. The scholars who serve these institutions possess learning, combining theological knowledge acquired through study in centers that remain accessible with wisdom inherited from ancestors whose understanding developed through exposure to traditions that influence thinking throughout regions where intellectual exchange once flourished, despite differences in language and custom. These learned men provide guidance that extends beyond purely spiritual matters. Their teachings influence the festivals that mark the religious calendar, providing opportunities for communities to express identity, honoring both current requirements and memories of ancestors, whose observances included elements surviving in modified forms, despite pressure to conform to standards emphasizing unity over diversity. Celebrations that once incorporated influences from multiple traditions evolve into occasions satisfying new expectations while preserving connections to heritage-defining identity, even when political structures change beyond recognition. Such community gatherings often center around marriages that demonstrate how dramatically social customs have adapted. Wedding ceremonies reflect alliances serving populations that must find suitable partners within territories that may not include individuals whose backgrounds meet traditional expectations for maintaining family status or relationships. Young people whose ancestors married for purposes serving imperial strategies now choose spouses based on personal compatibility and practical considerations, enabling survival rather than advancement through connections that no longer provide advantages in circumstances where local reputation matters more than distant relationships. The women who organize these celebrations face challenges their ancestors never encountered. They manage households that depend primarily on family labor, while maintaining traditions honoring ancestors whose lives encompassed experiences that current circumstances cannot replicate. Their responsibilities include preserving knowledge, enabling communities to maintain capabilities beyond basic survival, while adapting practices to resources available locally rather than materials that once arrived through networks spanning continents. Medical knowledge exemplifies this pattern of adaptation and preservation. Healers who serve these communities combine remedies utilizing plants and minerals available locally with techniques inherited from traditions that developed through exposure to practices from across the known world. Their effectiveness demonstrates how wisdom accumulated through generations of experience can survive, even when the exotic ingredients and sophisticated institutions that once supported advanced healing become unavailable due to disrupted supply chains and political instability. The children raised in these communities inherit both the memory of vanished greatness and practical wisdom needed for survival in circumstances requiring different skills than their ancestors possessed. Their education prepares them for lives that may require abandoning familiar territories if political conditions deteriorate beyond tolerance levels that each family must determine, based on circumstances changing without warning or explanation. Their identity reflects synthesis, enabling survival, while honoring heritage, defining who they are, even when external pressures encourage conformity that might erase distinctive characteristics. Libraries that preserve written knowledge represent perhaps the most poignant symbol of this transformation. Collections that once filled rooms serving scholars from across the known world now consist of private holdings maintained by families who understand their value, even when they lack education needed for comprehending texts written in scripts requiring lifetimes to master. Books that survive selection processes, favoring practical knowledge over theoretical learning, include works providing guidance for conducting business, treating illness, and maintaining skills. enabling self-sufficiency when external support becomes unavailable. Manuscripts copied by scribes who focus on preserving essential works in scripts that local populations can read ensure that crucial knowledge survives even when sophisticated institutions disappear due to lack of resources needed for supporting advanced learning. The texts they produce may lack artistic sophistication, characterizing production during more prosperous periods, but they serve essential functions in preserving information, enabling communities to maintain capabilities beyond mere survival. As the 11th century reaches its midpoint, these scattered communities represent the final chapter in stories that began when ambitious merchants first dreamed of carrying goods between civilizations that seemed destined to remain forever separate. The networks that once connected them to distant markets have contracted to relationships serving immediate needs, rather than grand visions requiring trust in authorities whose reliability extended across vast distances and diverse political jurisdictions. Yet wisdom accumulated through centuries of successful adaptation survives in forms that may prove useful when circumstances change to favor enterprises requiring understanding of human nature across boundaries, separating peoples who share common needs despite differences in language, custom, and belief. The skills they preserved include not merely technical knowledge required for producing goods, but insight into principles enabling cooperation when survival depends on building relationships rather than maintaining barriers. Stories told to children include heroes whose adventures occurred in times when the world seemed larger and more promising than current circumstances suggest. Yet their essential messages speak to eternal truths about courage, wisdom, and persistence required for achieving anything worthy of remembrance. Though great caravans no longer wind through mountain passes toward markets that welcomed goods from distant lands, the spirit that enabled such achievements survives in hearts remembering when dreams could span continents and when human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle that circumstances placed in the path of those determined to connect rather than divide the scattered communities sharing this earth. Final silence falls like evening shadows across valleys where voices once negotiated in languages enabling communication between civilizations eager to learn from each other's achievements. What remains are memories preserved in stones marking graves, in patterns woven into cloth, in melodies echoing with rhythms learned from ancestors whose names have become legends, and in wisdom enabling survival when the world changes beyond recognition. But human needs remain constant across generations, inheriting both achievements and sorrows of those who came before.